Welcome to our first double pointed needle sock tutorial. In this we're going to be knitting the cuff and all the way to the leg. We're going to be using a set of 5 double pointed needles. We will be knitting with one and holding our yarn on the other 4 needles. This allows you to keep a nice square in your knitting and means that you're not pulling it at any point. We're also going to use some double knitting weight sock yarn and some stitch markers. I have probably a few too many, but I'm going to use them to show you how to make sure that your socks are the same length. To start, we're going to cast on using one needle, and we're going to use a long tail cast on method. I use this method as it is a loose method and allows the rib of your sock to sit comfortably on your leg. For a long tail cast on, the first thing that you do is you estimate the amount of yarn that you're going to need. So what I do is I use a hand wrap per 10 stitches that I'm going to cast on, and I do that, it's an approximation. I do that for double knitting and for 4-ply weight yarn. You will get kind of used to it. It's a funny one. There are other methods available for doing it as well. So here I'm going to count out 4 different hand wraps, and that's what I'm going to have for my cast on. So the next thing I'm going to do then is I am going to create a slip knot. To create your slip knot, you take your yarn and you put your working yarn over to the right hand side, well, to your right hand side of the screen, and you dangle it over your hand like that, so over your index finger. You then take your working yarn and wrap it around the finger underneath, take it over the tail of the yarn, lift it, and then bring through the yarn through the center of the hole and pull it out to create your slip knot. Do that again now, just so that you can see, and it slips out as it is a slip knot. So again, place over the yarn over your hand, take your working yarn that attached to the ball, take it underneath your finger and then over the tail yarn, lift the tail yarn and pull through the working yarn through that. Easier done than described, I'm afraid. And there you have your slip knot. So you are now ready to knit. So then you insert your needle into the slip knot and tighten it. So that slip knot counts as your first stitch in your row. So then you get ready to do your long tail cast on. You have your tail yarn and you have your working yarn, which is that attached to the ball. Take your 2 fingers of your left hand and pinch them together, put them in between the tail yarn and the working yarn, and using the 3 fingers that are remaining, grasp the yarns and hold them tightly. Not too tightly, and then spread your fingers and be ready to go. So now you'll see that you have your thumb and your index finger with yarn around them, and you have your needle in the center. So you're now ready to cast on. So you have your slip knot, which is your first stitch, and you're getting ready to go. So you take your needle in your hand, not too tightly, because you do want to be able to move it. You're going to take it down to the left towards your thumb, over both threads of yarn, and then you're going to come up through the center of the yarn with the yarn over your needle. You're then going to go to the right. You're going to see the thread on the index finger come down between it, and then bring it through the loop that's on your thumb the other way. And then you're going to tighten that off, and that is how you create your stitches using the long tail cast on. Down to the left, up through the center of the yarn on the thumb, over the yarn on the index finger, down through the center grasping the yarn, then back through the loop the other way of the loop on the thumb, and then slip that off your thumb, and as you slip it off you grasp the tail yarn with the thumb again to tighten off the stitch. Now it takes a little bit of practice, that we're going to go through it a few times. So down to the left, up through the center, over the yarn on the index finger and down through the center there, grasping the yarn, then back through the loop on the thumb, slipping it off the thumb, and then tightening it using the tail of the yarn again. Down to the left, up through the center, over, under, and through. It does take a little bit of practice to get that movement right. So let's do that again. Down to the left, up through the center, over the yarn on the index finger, down through the center, grasping the yarn through the loop, slip it off, catch the working yarn with your thumb and pull it. Not too tightly, and we'll be doing another tutorial to show you how to do this even more loosely, because a loose cast on is really key when you're doing a sock. So keep doing that a few more times. So down to the left, over, grab, through, slip it off, and grasp your tail yarn. I would give that a really good practice as you go. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go away and I'm going to finish my cast on and come back to you once I've that completed. So remember to cast on the number of stitches for the size of sock that you're making. I'm casting on 44 because I'm making the smallest size in the pattern. So I now have all of my stitches cast on, so I have 44 stitches because I'm making the smallest size of the double knitting pattern. So What I do now is I cast on one additional stitch. So I do this every time I'm joining in the round because it's how I like to avoid any gap in them. If you look at the PDF for this, there are a number of different ways that you can avoid it. This happens to be my favorite way of doing it. And I'll show you what to do with that extra stitch in a minute once we've distributed the stitches and we have moved on to joining in the round. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to distribute my stitches evenly over my 4 needles so that I have one spare to knit with the 5th. We'll also talk about what happens if you have only 3 needles and a 4th needle to knit with. We'll talk about that in a second. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first 11 stitches and place those onto this needle. Now if you are using 3 needles to do this, just distribute your stitches over the 3 needles. So divide the total number of stitches by 3 and just distribute them. We'll talk a little bit more when we come to the heel flap and how you change that for DPNs as well. So once you've distributed your stitches, take them down and place them into the center of your needle. This is useful if it's the first time you've used DPNs. It means that they don't slip off as quickly. Now I'm just going to zip through and distribute the rest of the stitches onto my needles. A little bit quick there. So again, you'll see here with this, as I move it into the middle of the needle and then it hangs down and you just let them go. And once your tension is right with a little bit of practice, you will find that that is something that happens quite normally for you. Might take a little bit of a go, but it's definitely something you'll get used to. So now we have distributed them on all 4 of them, and I'm just going to make sure that I have 11 on all and 12 on my last one, which is my extra stitch for joining in the round, which I will show you in just a second. Before joining in the round though, you want to make sure that your stitches aren't twisted, and it's at this point you check them. So here you will see on one side you have all these little ridged bumps, so they're the back of the stitches as you cast on, and you can see that they're all facing one another. You want to make sure that they're not twisted. The needles sit quite normally like this. You will notice if they're twisted. So once you have all of your stitches and you've checked that they're not twisted, you need to make sure that you're in the right way for working around. So you're going to take your work and twist and turn over your needles to make sure that everything is in the right place. And again, make sure that they're not twisted before you do this. So you take the start, you're going to make sure that the start and end of your cast on are together. And again here, adjust your needles as you go, making sure that your stitches are in the right place. There's a couple of things to remember when you're joining in the round. You need to position your tail and your working yarn in the right place. So for your working yarn, you want to make sure that it's positioned so that it is ready to work and it comes out through the top of the circle, the top of your round, as opposed to going through the middle of your round once you're joined, because that just makes it a little bit trickier to work. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to join in the round. I use the extra stitch that I cast on earlier and I move it to beside the first stitch I cast on, my slip knot, when I originally cast on. And then I tighten them up a little bit using my tail and my working yarn. It is a little bit fiddly, but it is definitely worthwhile. So what you do then is you take your needle that you're going to knit with and you insert it to both the first and last cast on stitches and knit those 2 stitches together. So you still, once this stitch is done, you have the correct stitch count that you want, but you have joined nicely in the round. You can use other methods and they're outlined in the PDF for this tutorial. This just happens to be my favorite and the one I find most secure. And that is the secret of joining in the round. Absolutely no bother at all. So what you're doing now is you're going to be knitting the rib. So as part of this cuff pattern, for this pattern, it's a 2x2 rib, so a knit 2, purl 2 rib. And if you haven't knit on DPNs before, we'll talk about how you knit off of one needle using your spare needle and then how you change needles as you come to the end. So the main idea is that you work all the stitches on one needle onto the other needle, and then you have a spare needle, and then you will change over as you come to that, and you'll see that just now in the video. So I've just emptied one needle onto one needle. I've emptied one needle onto another, and I now have a spare needle, which I swap into my working hand, and I'm ready to go. So depending on whether you have a knit or a purl stitch next, and many people prefer to start their rib stitches on a knit stitch as it's slightly smaller in terms of being able to keep it a little bit tighter. I happen to have it on the purl stitch next in this tutorial, but you can absolutely do what you'd like. So you make sure that they're quite tight, not too tight, but just a little bit tight. Same kind of tension, even tension all the way around. And again, you are now working your stitches from one needle onto the other. So you continue knitting the rib stitches around from needle to needle. So again, you're going to work to the end of this needle, doing your 2x2 rib, and then you will swap hands again with the needle. So you take all of the stitches from one onto the other. Now the main thing is at this point there is no need to panic if you find yourself with more stitches on the other. I'm going to show you how to place the round marker in just a second. So you continue on, and again manipulate the needle so that the stitches are in the center so that they're easier to keep on. And that again is down to your tension, something you will definitely get with practice. I hate saying it, but knitting really is just practice. So we're off again, and this time I'm going in underneath, and I'm going to purl 2 stitches. I'm going to purl all, knit the next 2. And we'll talk about doing rib stitch in the round as we come to do the next round. Another thing about knitting in the round as well is that you can just, once your tension is really good, you're focusing on the needles in your hand, and this is also going to be the case when you are working with your magic loop as well. It's thinking about the needles in your hand rather than worrying too much about where everything else is. That's something that you get as you get used to doing it. So we're going to finish the last round here, and you know where you are because you have distributed them over the 4 needles, and then we're going to talk about what number needles these are as well. So you come to the end of your round, you know where you are because you have the tail of yarn and you're working back, and you've worked the yarn off of 4 needles onto 4 other needles, and you have a spare needle in your hand right now. So in the pattern for this tutorial, the needles are numbered. So the first needle after your round is 1, 2, 3 and 4, and you're knitting with the 5th. And it's important to make sure that you have the right stitches on the right needles when you're doing key things in the pattern. But the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to place a round marker so that you know where the start of your round is. And in double pointed needles, you do this not by putting it on and letting it fall off, because if you put it on the end of the needle, that's no good. What I do is I work the first stitch of my round and then I place the marker onto the needle. So you knit your first stitch, then you place your marker, and then you knit the next stitch, and that is what holds your marker on your needle as you go. So this is slightly different if you are working on a long circular or a circular needle. You would normally have it before the first stitch of the round, but because you're trying to avoid having it fall off your needle, you put it in 1 stitch from the start, but you always know which one is your start stitch of your round. So once you've placed your marker, you are ready to continue working in the round. And if you haven't knit rib in the round, it is slightly different to knitting it flat. So if I was knitting a rib back and forth, I would be knitting 2, purling 2, knitting 2, and on the way back I would purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. Whereas if you're knitting them in the round, you're actually doing the same stitches on top of one another because you're not going back and forth, so you don't need to change them. The pattern tells you what you're doing, and if you have a different type of rib in a pattern, it will also be specified. So you might do a 1x1 rib, or you might have no rib, or you might have lots of different ideas. You might have a corrugated rib, depending on the type of sock that you're knitting. And then basically you just keep going around and around to make the rib as long as you need to. The pattern that you're making will tell you how long to make the rib, and then over time you will develop a preference. So now I'm going to go away, finish my rib, and I will be back just as soon as it's finished. So once you've knit the number of rows specified in the pattern for your rib, or for your cuff, you're actually knitting the cuff of the sock. So once you've knit that, you are ready to start your leg. It generally starts at the start of round marker, and if that's different, it will tell you in the pattern. So there's a couple of things to remember when you're knitting, that when you come to knit the leg of your sock. If you are going to be placing markers, because you're going to be doing a pattern on the leg, you would often do it at this point. The next thing you may also be doing at this point is if you are increasing or decreasing any stitches because your rib required a number of stitches but your leg requires a different one. And also in some cases you might be changing needle sizes. I don't in my pattern, but again that depends on what you're doing, particularly in a colourwork sock where you might need a bigger needle to give yourself a little bit more space for the stranded colourwork. But in this pattern there aren't any changes, it's just the stocking stitch for the required length of the leg. So one thing to remember is stocking stitch in the round is different to stocking stitch worked back and forth. So you knit every round, whereas if I was knitting stocking stitch flat, I would knit a round, a row, I would knit a row and purl a row. But that is not the case when you're doing it in the round. And I think it's part of the reason that socks are so popular is because there's no purl stitches for those of us who prefer a nice, easy, straight knit. So I'm going to just do the first row of this, and we'll talk a little bit then about some of the foibles of working with double pointed needles. So again, the same rules apply as you were doing your ribbing. You swap needles as you come to the end of them and you knit off of them. So you're working from one needle onto the other, and something that is a quirk of working with double pointed needles and that worries some people is what we call laddering. And laddering occurs between where your needles are in your work, and so the first stitch of the first stitch on the next needle can often be knit slightly baggily, if that's the right word. It can be a little bit loose. So what you're trying to do at all times is keep a really even tension. So you're not trying to pull it too tight, but you're definitely trying to make sure that it's not loose. And by making sure that you're always using the same amount of yarn for each stitch, regardless of whether it's on the middle of the needle or whether it's the first or last stitch of each double pointed needle as you go. Well, I'll just show you what that looks like. So often when you're doing this, it's tempting to not quite finish the stitch as you go. And what you can see here, and I'll show you, is that it's gone a little bit baggy. What you're trying to do is keep it nice and even as you pull it in, not having any gape there, because you can see how very quickly that would ladder. So look at that again here, and you can actually see that the stitch I've done as I came on from the purl stitch in the first round of stocking stitch is a little bit baggy. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to knit that, show you how to do it again, making sure that you're pulling at nice even tension, not making sure that there's no gap, because you can see how quickly you would have like a ladder, which is why they call it that, because that's what it looks like. The aim here is to keep the stitch as evenly sized with the others as possible, so not too loose, not too tight, because it does pucker or it keeps a ladder. So what you can see is that as I show you here, you just want to keep the yarn around the same size as it goes around the needle and the space between them so that you don't get any laddering. There is a way of kind of manipulating it so that you don't have to worry. So if you knit to the end of this row, well, this needle, I'll show you how it's done. So normally at this point you would then change from having one needle and to the other, but you don't actually have to do that. You can knit one stitch off of that needle onto the other. And if you do that every time you come to the end of each row or every needle, you're creating a kind of spiral as you go. And what that does is it always moves the position of the potentially baggy stitches around and around. Now, if you do very baggy stitches, you will just have a spiral ladder in your knitting. So I would recommend practicing this until you get it right. So as you see, you can keep moving the first stitch on each needle to being the last stitch on the previous needle, and you just keep working around and around. One thing that's very, very important to remember if you're doing this is to remember where your start of round is. So you know that your start of round marker is one stitch in from the start of round because you've been using it on double pointed needles, and you do need to remember where your needles are as you come to the end of the leg. So bearing in mind that you do need to know where needles 1, 2, 3 and 4 are as you come to knit the heel flap. But again, that is something that you can just redistribute your needles as you come to the end of the leg. So we're now just going to continue knitting the leg of the sock until it is the length specified in the pattern, and that is knit from the cast on edge. If you're following the double knitting pattern, it is 6 inches. If you're following the 4-ply pattern, it is 8 inches, but that is something for personal preference. I am going to knit mine probably about 3 inches from the cast on edge, as this is a demonstration sock. So you just keep knitting around and around in stocking stitch until you're ready to finish the leg. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial on starting off your sock. The next video will cover the heel flap and heel turn.